our next speaker then is Leonora Neville. Leonora Neville needs no introduction for Byzantinists. She's the John and Jan Rowe Professor of Byzantine History and Villa's Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so actually quite close to us. And she works in a broad range of different fields. Her first book, published by Cambridge in 2004, was Authority in Byzantine Provincial Society, 950 to 1100, where she studied provincial bureaucracy in connection with society. And then over the last years, she is very well known to all of us for her studies on, I think, perhaps the most famous writer couple in Byzantine history, Nikephoros Vreienios and Anna Komnene, with two really outstanding books in which she analyzed not only matters of historiography and narrative and so, but also very important questions of gender and gender representation in these really important key texts of Byzantine history. She then also published very recently a guide to Byzantine historical writing and Byzantine gender, so really outstanding work. And today she will talk about community, taxation and religion in Eastern Roman villages. Leonora, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the warm introduction and the wonderful hospitality. It's been lovely to be here. And thanks to Mark for outstanding research and bringing us all together. I very much appreciate the way that you are using our scarce documentary evidence with archaeology to bring us new understandings of Byzantine village life. I would like today to talk about taxation of villages and how the taxation systems may have affected their social and cultural life. And the dichotomy of church and state, of spiritual and temporal, comes natural to many people in our modern era, regardless of their personal religious heritage. And I hold that this distinction between church matters and state matters is relatively modern, that it's an aspect of Western European culture and politics, and that it's distorting for the study of the pre-modern history. And if you're confused about why I began by announcing my topic as taxation, and then started talking about church and state, I think that confusion might stem from the way that your mind categorizes taxation automatically as something that is secular and non-religious. Right? An illustration of the dichotomy that still lingers in our minds and defines what our topics are, what our subjects are. I would like to challenge that categorization as a remnant of political and religious debate and antagonism that is not pertinent in later Roman society. The lack of distinction between political, civic matters and religious matters, or rather, the constant purposeful and intentional intertwining of religious matters and political, civic matters, are now seen as one of the most striking characteristics of the classical Roman Empire. And Christianity became the new imperial religion. Habits and assumptions about the mutual support, about the roles of government and religion, in some sense, have remained. And I see abundant evidence for civic religion in the medieval Eastern Empire. So by civic religion, I mean religious ideas and actions that are intended to benefit the entire polity, instrumentally and materially, things that you do to make things better now, usually undertaken by elite political actors acting in official capacities. And in the centuries surrounding the Council of Nicaea, the propositional beliefs, the thought and theology of the Roman imperial government changed from traditional Roman polytheism to Christianity. That's not in doubt, right? And certainly in all eras, there were variances and strands of devotional practice in Christianity that were entirely apolitical and had nothing to do with the Roman state or any other state. And at the same time, some strands of Christianity did become the new Roman imperial religion. So this is one of the things that happens if you take seriously the fact that the Roman Empire is a single entity. right? We divide it in half and chop it up so that there's a classical part and a, quote, Byzantine part, right? When we take Christianity as fundamentally transformational for everything. So that is part of the transformation that makes a medieval world not a classical world, is that with Christianity everything changed, and therefore you have a new different kind of state, that's the Roman Empire. But if you actually think about the later Roman Empire and the earlier Roman Empire as a single thing, what happens if you imagine the study of Roman religion as a single entity, right? From Numa through the 15th century, right? Then you can start seeing a lot of new things. So I take the vast research that's been done by people studying the classical Roman Empire on civic religion, which has transformed our understanding of the ancient Roman state and why it's appealing, and proves definitively that when Edward Gibbon said that it was barbarism and religion that killed the Roman Empire, right? There's an implicit assumption there that the classical Roman Empire was not religious, all the temples notwithstanding. Right? If you take seriously that the ancient Roman Empire was profoundly religious, and that religion is intertwined in every aspect of Roman politics, and that the ideas of all the priests were politicians and all the politicians were priests, and nothing happened in the Roman government that wasn't done under divine auspices with the purpose of making sure that they had divine favor. Right? If you take all that seriously, then it's nonsensical to say that the coming of religion killed the Roman Empire. The propositional theology changed, but religion was not new. Right? Taking that, and then thinking about the medieval phase of the Roman Empire, I think we're able to see a great deal of evidence that we have just ignored. We've been blind to, and we've seen through it. When we look at what I see as evidence for Roman civic religion in the medieval era, we either say, oh, that's just political ideology. They can't have really cared about it. They didn't mean what they said, right? Or we just miss it, right? I don't think any of the theologians should feel badly that they didn't think, oh, I should look at the taxes for information about medieval religion, right? But now, when you look at the taxes, it's all about religion, okay? So let's get into the taxes. And I also want to say that the exploration of civic religion in the Christian Roman Empire helps us understand medieval orthodoxy a lot better and provides a lot of evidence to back up Mark's ideas about the church as being used as civic space. So, the taxation system of the 10th century. I see it as a manifestation of civic religious practice as well as revenue extraction. Taxation is the point at which provincial people, they meet their government and they are knit into a common political life. And the system also places them in a relationship with the emperor, who is, they believe, to be divinely appointed and in relationship with God. And hence, it puts them also in a relationship with God. It's also the moment, taxation is when divine imperial mercy and redemption were enacted and concretized. So most of the vocabulary of fiscal administration has clear theological meanings. So the fiscal terms use a vocabulary of taxation. So the words they use in the vocabulary of taxation are much more commonly known to the citizens of the empire as theological vocabulary having to do with redemption. So the vocabulary of taxation has fiscal officials giving mercy or correction or restoration on behalf of the empire, on the behalf of God. The merciful tax relief came from God, mediated through the emperor and his imperial servants. So models of ancient Roman civic religion provide a way of taking seriously the religious vocabulary of the government actions such as taxation. So this is stuff, when you look at any fiscal documents, you try to figure out what's going on, you go to the big dictionary and you find 5 or 6 pages of stuff about theology, and then very carefully it'll say to, second meaning, not connected, and there's the fiscal meaning, right? Yeah, that's us making a distortion on these things. All right. So in the 10th century, taxes were collected by one group of officials would go around from village to village and write down everybody who lived there and how much every single person owed. And then a different person would come around later with the big book and look and find their name and figure out how much they owed. And theoretically, you'd redo the books every 30 years. I'm not sure it ever happened, but And so if a citizen was unable to pay their taxes, the inspectors would grant those lands an exemption that would encourage them to stay around and not flee, so that they could continue to work the land rather than avoid taxation by running away. Right? So land with such an exemption couldn't be sold even if it was fully abandoned, so that the villagers would be able to return home. These exemptions are called sympathia. The idea was that a reduction in taxation would allow the new owners to stay and work the land. Sympathia also means compassion in moral and theological contexts. It's the usual word for the compassion that a saint has for a sinner. It's often included in lists of spiritual virtues. Peace, mercy, compassion, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control are a list of virtues that Simeon, New Theologian, talks about. It's often paired with mercy and love of humanity, philanthropos and elemosini. And so that grant of that mercy was supposed to last for 30 years. And after 30 years, two things could happen. One is restoration, orthosis. Orthosis is the standard theological word for a restoration of a fallen sinner comes back, you're redeemed. Right? And if you weren't redeemed, then you were completely fallen. Right? And if you're completely fallen, that's the word for completely unredeemed, fallen and lapsed into sin. Right? We've got one of the homilies of Photius, he just says, we have fallen, we've been restored, using these same terms that are used for taxation, right, when you're fallen or restored. Once your land, if you're completely fallen and unredeemed, your land gets taken out of the registration form from your village so it can be resold, and then becomes a klasma, which is a broken bit. Right? Most commonly used as a broken bit of communion bread, right? That you get. And of course, the name for taxation work is liturgia, which is liturgy. And so we make a big distinction. Well, there's the divine liturgy, and then there's the taxation liturgy. But the taxation liturgy is the public work through which you get mediated your redemption, your mercy, your restoration. Right? That's the liturgy, it's the divine liturgy that actually is materially manifesting the mercy for you and that you don't have to pay your taxes. And the taxes are the phoros, which is the prosphoro is the word for the offering. When you come in the liturgy, you bring forward your gifts, right? So there's a liturgical sense that you bring forward your gifts to the altar, and that's how you make the communion, right? That's the same terminology that's used for the taxes that you give to the empire. So it's reasonable to think that the material mercy of the assessors would have been understood, at least by some, as a manifestation of divine mercy, particularly when you think of how often the emperors are always the divine emperors, right? They're always the Christ-loving, they're always the Christ-chosen, the vocabulary. And this is what we see through. There's never a mention of an emperor that isn't cloaked in theological terms, that we just say, oh, that's ideology, right? And it's ideology because it's an emperor and that's secular. No, it's the Christ-loving emperor chosen by Christ, chosen by God, grants you this mercy. Right? And I want to point out that this mercy is a real manifestation. If we think that you are unable to pay your taxes, right, it becomes completely fallen and unredeemed when you've been killed in wars, captured by raiders, died of plague, died of famine, and that's why you couldn't return in 30 years, right? So the people who had recovered enough so that they could return to paying taxes, they were the lucky ones, right? So when we giggle at the cynicism of saying, oh, your tax imposition is your restoration and your redemption, right? We miss how participating in a polity in the Middle Ages with an orderly taxation system and plenty enough to share with others is far from a universal experience in the Middle Ages. And it is a matter of rejoicing. We don't have to assume that anyone was happy about paying taxes to see that this is more than a metaphor, right, of restoration. It's certainly not cynical. And then the sympathia, the grant of tax-free status, meant only that not only that the land couldn't be taxed, but that it couldn't be sold. Right? And if the goal of the fiscal administration was the maximization of material resources, If the goal of the fisc was to get as much money as possible, you'd never do it that way, right? If the land is empty and you can take it and sell it to somebody else who's going to work it and make you money next year, you'd do that, right? So it's an act of mercy that is grounded in a belief about the way things ought to be that overrides the capitalist instinct towards maximization of revenue. Right? And in this context, let's take a moment to think about the laws in the 10th century that were enacted with the purpose of returning lands that had been sold under pressure during a famine to the original owners, on explicitly religious grounds of enacting divine justice. In the opening of Romanos I's law on land, he says, regarding human greed, from greed, hence the great confusion of affairs, hence the great tide of injustices, hence the great and widespread oppression of the poor, and the great sighing of the needy, for whose sake the Lord rose from the dead. For he says, for the oppression of the poor, for the sighing of the needy, now I will arise, saith the Lord. If God, our Creator and Savior, who made us emperor, rises in retribution, how will the poor man, who awaits only the eyes of the emperor for intercession, be neglected and altogether forgotten by us? Romanos is there quoting from the Psalms, right? And he makes simultaneously a moral and religious argument that he is required to uphold the poor. So declaring the land tax exempt and unsellable was an expression of mercy for the people who had abandoned the land rather than a maximization of resources. And the emperors were acting in imitation of God. What does God do? God upholds the poor, right? And gives succor to the oppressed. Right? This is what the emperors are trying to do in their own mimetic relationship with God. The sheer scope and scale of the tax assessment books is also an act of imitation of divine omniscience. If you think about someone spending the money to try to go to every single one of those little villages, every single house, who lives here? And our tiny scraps of evidence, they have little tiny amounts of taxes that they are owed, right? The tax books are also a total mess, right? It didn't really work. There's no way, I've tried real hard. If anybody wants to do more medieval math and try to figure out the cadastre of Thebes, I've tried to add that thing up every single way. It just doesn't add up, right? So what's the point of having a gigantic, wildly expensive effort to note down every single person with their taxes, right, if you're not going to be able to use it for the money, right? Because it's not really all about the money. It's about being knit together in a divine community. It's about the emperor knowing where you are. It's a manifestation of divine omniscience, which the emperor has for you. And it's a reflection of the imperial care for you in your household. Right? Back my early essay in the Cadastre of Thebes, I said it was a ceremonial document. Right? It had a ceremonial role in the ritual of taxation, only because at that point in my career I wasn't really saying, hey, this is all about religion, right? It's taken me some time, and I'm glad to come back to it. There's the theorists of ancient religion do a lot to give us vocabulary for talking about the value of a religion that helps you feel placed and grounded and in a system, right? There's theories and vocabulary that can help us understand that we can talk about later. Let's just move on. Another thing that this registration system did was that the far and away the most commonly known bit of Roman fiscal history, just about everybody knows a little Roman fiscal history because you read it about it at Christmas, right? When Joseph and Mary went to get registered for taxation, right? And the apographie, the same vocabulary, of course, that's in the Gospel of Luke is the one that's used by the medieval Roman state. And it was believed in the medieval phase of the Roman Empire that Augustus's calling of the census was a divinely ordained act, right? That the reason why the incarnation happened at the moment of Augustus was that was the time the world was at peace. And that's why the Roman Empire conquered the world, was so that it was the divine plan, right, to create peace at the moment of the incarnation. So, no less than John Chrysostom preached, Augustus did not publish his edict on the census of his own accord, but God aroused his spirits to do so. so that even unwittingly he might minister to the birth of Christ. So from that's Chrysostom. He's pretty early. Certainly by the 10th century, the Roman imperial state is a divine state. It's the state of God's people. When Romanos in his law is talking about the Lord as God and the Lord in the Psalms and the Lord as him, it's seamless that the Roman state is a divine state. So the active registration of every family on every bit of land is an active maintenance of continuity with the empire of Augustus, and it places all of those people in mimetic relationships with the Holy Family. And then we can see what I consider the function of the registration process in grounding each citizen in their place in the divine cosmos is visible in the words for the people who are not paying taxes directly to the emperor. If you're not in this relationship of a citizen paying taxes to your emperor, you're a parikos, right? And the pariki are sojourners, which is the Septuagint term for Israel and Egypt, for your hired person, for some it's people who are present but not grounded. Moses in Media was a stranger in a strange land, and that's the word for parikos. So these people, they're there, but they're outside this system. And we know that many pariki owned land. It's not a distinction really between owning and renting, but it's where does your revenue go? Does your revenue put you in relationship with the emperor? Or does your revenue go to like a monastery or a landlord or somebody else, like your person who you're helping out, right? So it's a distinction between being inscribed in the cosmic taxis or staying alongside it. And slipping outside this registration meant becoming a stranger. Right? And people will say, oh yes, but in the later centuries, almost everyone, they're all pariki, right? And I would argue that this sense of civic religion declines. So in my vision of Roman civic religion, it seems to be huge in the 10th century. It seems to be very much absent in the 12th. And I see that as the engine, that the true explanation of all these 11th century cultural shifts. We've identified dozens of different things that changed in the 11th century. I think they are all epiphenomena to the decline of civic religion. And then I'm not surprised. Once civic religion is gone, the empire falls pretty quickly. Right? So when everyone is a parikos, we're all pariki, we're not in this relationship with the emperor. Suddenly your landlord, your bishop, they become the people, it's fragmentation, the system falls apart. Right? So civic religion changes. It's something that we need to address, be aware of, think about, and look for. Is it there? Is it present? Is it not present? And not expect any kind of uniformity. And I see a lot of change. But for much of the period in which Mark is talking about, right, we can consider returning now to his villages and villagers and where do they do their things. In Mark's chapters, he describes how villagers probably gathered in churches as the neutral space, right, and having a separate use, right? But it's not, in fact, a different use. It's care for community. When you gather to talk about your community, to resolve your issues, and to advocate for yourselves, that civic work is care for community, which is the point of civic religion. Right? You're getting your community right, you're getting rid of sinful contention and bringing around harmony by ending your differences, right? The goal is to live in harmony and to live in Christian unity, right? And you're going to do that by getting together. So that is, I would say, it's a religious purpose. So seen from, if we keep the valiance of civic religion as a possibility, then we don't need to imagine that, well, there aren't services right now, the church is closed, we can use it for the sort of off-brand, prescription purpose. No, it's core function. And with that, I think I'm going to leave it. I've got plenty more to say, but I'd rather answer questions. Thank you.